There are a lot of capabilities that the web server controls have that the simple HTML server controls don't have. One is an auto postback property that triggers postbacks based on changes to the control value. The server controls have more intuitive names for what the controls do, as well as for their properties. There's better support for the controls within the Visual Studio Designer, with smart tags and event pickers, for example. There's individual attributes for cascading style sheet style properties instead of a single style attribute, so you can get a lot more granular with how you format these controls. There are a number of complex controls that aggregate many HTML controls and integrate JavaScript code, all generated dynamically when the page is built on the web server. They provide browser detection as well as automatic adaptation, meaning that the control will customize to some extent the HTML that is generated to meet the capabilities of the browser that is being used to access the website. So in general, you're going to want to use the web server controls rather than the HTML controls. All of the web server controls are built on the web control class. So the system.web.ui.webcontrols namespace has a collection of classes that let you create web server controls on an ASP.NET page. All server controls inherit from that web control class. And that means that you have access to all of the functionality of that base web control class in any server controls that you use, as well as any custom controls that you create on your own. Whenever you drop a web control on a page from the Visual Studio Designer, which you can do either in Source View or in Design View, a variable declaration is created behind the scenes based on the ID of the new control. And that declaration lets you work with the control in your code by referring to the object variable. It also lets you create event handling procedures for the control. And what this is doing behind the scenes is hooking into all of the features of the inherited web control class. Now, the web control class provides many standard control properties, including things like access key, back color, forecolor, enable view state, font, height, ID, style, tab index, visible, width, and many more. The different control classes that are derived from web control include a lot of their own unique properties, whatever is needed to make, for example, a text box a text box. Some of the properties hold simple values, but some, for example the font property, hold objects with properties of their own. In code, you might set a label's font to bold by setting label1.font.bold to true. In the HTML source code of an ASPX page, such complex properties are expressed using a hyphen instead of a dot. For example, you could set the font bold attribute of the label to true using code that looks like this. One very valuable feature of web controls, as I mentioned, is the ability to detect browser capabilities and create appropriate output for both basic and rich browsers. Rich browsers are generally those that support HTML 4.0 and later. All web server controls have the ASP:namespace prefix to denote that they're derived from the system.web.ui.webcontrols namespace. The HTML that they render on the client depends on the browser that is being used to access the page. If you look at the HTML source in the Visual Studio Designer, you'll see code that looks like this for a button control. The attributes that are shown here are not those of HTML elements. They are instead properties of the web control. Some are derived from the inherited web control class, and others, such as the text attribute, are unique to the button control. When the page runs on the client, ASP.NET renders the control based on the settings that you configured, using the HTML that is appropriate for the particular browser that's running. For example, that button will be rendered looking something like the HTML shown here. Depending on the browser, the button could be rendered either as an input tag or as a button tag, and this HTML is generated for Internet Explorer 7 so it's rendered as an input tag. So let's start looking at some of the controls that you can use in your web pages. If you simply want to display static text, you can just go ahead and add the text directly to the HTML pane of the designer within the page. But you can use the label control when you need to access or change the text programmatically at runtime. In essence, the label control lets you customize it when the page is being created for a particular user. If you want to, you can also bind the text property of the label control, or in fact other properties, to a data source to automatically display database information. So let's take a look and see how this works. Let's see how to add a label control to a web page and set its properties. I'll go ahead and open this test page, which opens by default in Source View. I'll change over to Design View. This is just a simple container page that you can play around with within the Controls sample application. I'll come over to the toolbox. If the toolbox doesn't appear, you can select it from View Toolbox within the Visual Studio menu, and I'll drag a label over to the page. Now I can press F4 to display the Properties page, or if it's already open, I can just come over and navigate to it within the tabs here. And I'll change the ID property of the control to Label Demo. Anytime you add a new control to an ASP.NET page, it gives it a default name, usually the name of the control with a number after it. In general, what a lot of developers do is, if the label control is going to be accessed programmatically, give it a name that indicates the kind of contents that it includes. But if it's just essentially a placeholder on the page to hold text, usually static text, then leaving the default name is fine. But follow whatever rules you have within your workplace. Next, I'll come to the back color property. I'll click on the ellipsis button, which opens up the More Colors dialog box. I'll go ahead and select to make the background color yellow, and click on OK, and notice that it has entered the yellow property in here. It's really easy to set properties for the control and to customize its appearance. You can also select property values when you're in Source View, but sometimes, as with colors and fonts, you won't have the same rich graphical interface. I'll come down here to Border Style. Notice that the default value is not set, but I'll change it to something flashy like Groove. That's essentially a nice 3D kind of a border. I'll also make it a little bit bigger by setting the border width property to 5 pixels. That makes it a little bit bigger and easier to see. Let's change the fore color. In this case, I'll just go ahead and type in something like blue. Notice that the font property has this plus sign in front of it that you can use to expand to reveal additional properties. I'll come over and set the name to Verdana. And I'll set the size to medium. I don't want to display label within the control, so I'll click on the text property and set it to label control. Let's add a tooltip as well, which most browsers will render for you. Not all will, but most of the modern browsers will. That gives a little bit of information to the user about what the control does. All right, at this point, we've designed the label and the page how we want it. So I'll go ahead and save it and go back over to Solution Explorer and right-click on the page to display it in the browser. And as you can see, we have a fancy border, we have a yellow background, we have the Verdana font, and if I hover over the control, it'll display the tooltip that gives the user some information. Let's go ahead and look at the HTML code that ASP.NET generated and sent down to the browser. Come here to View Source, and notice that the label is rendered as a span element. It has the ID, the name that we gave the control, The title attribute has the tooltip. There's some styling information. Most often when you set properties within the ASP.NET Server control, a lot of times that will render out as a value of an attribute. But other formatting attributes are often implemented as cascading style sheet styles. And so we have inline block for the display, color blue, background color yellow, and so forth. So as you can see, we changed a number of the properties, and most of them were rendered as styles within the style attribute. All right, so remember that this was rendered as a span tag. Let's go back over to the application now and take a look at the source. Notice that the HTML within the source page is completely different from what is rendered to the browser. First of all, it's an ASP.NET Server control. We know that because of the ASP prefix. We have an ID attribute that identifies it. It runs at server. We have a back color property. This is rendered as a style attribute within the page, but it's actually a property. So at runtime, ASP.NET looks at the definition for this control and looks at the browser that is being used to access the page, and then translates this into, in this case, a span element, setting various attributes and styles for the control as we've defined within the page. By the way, one of the things you can do is actually include text between the open and closing elements. If you do that, and if you provide any value for the text property, the value that you include between the tags will override, and that will be the text that is used on the page. Labels are useful for displaying text, but they don't allow users to enter data. And a lot of web pages do a lot more than just display text. ASP.NET supports several types of input controls, and all these controls are available as server controls. Now we're going to talk about the checkbox, text box, and radio button controls. One issue that you need to consider is the positioning of controls. Some of the examples in this chapter use absolute positioning. This was the default in previous versions of Visual Studio, and you may still find it convenient. But most web designers prefer to use tables or style sheets, and style sheets really is the choice for laying out web pages. But Visual Studio has rich support for inserting tables, and you can select Insert Table from the Table menu right within Visual Studio. If you want to modify the positioning method, select a control or set of controls and choose Position from the Format menu. And you can select Absolute, Relative, or None. Those are the three options that you have. Now we're going to talk about text box controls. The text box control lets a user enter text, oddly enough based on the name. But it also includes a text mode property that you can set to display the text in various ways. The default is single line. It just has everything in a single line. You can't hit enter and go to a second line or anything. It's just a small amount of text on one line within the form. You can also make it a multi-line text box. In this case, text is going to wrap inside the control so that multiple lines are visible. And it also has a scroll bar available if the text exceeds the amount of area available. And then the third form is password. In this case, the user input displays as a series of unreadable characters. By default, and most commonly as asterisks, that you often see within a password form. But you're not limited to using this text mode for just password input. Any kind of text that you want to obscure, you can set this text mode. So let's explore the features of the text box control. Here I'm running one of the pages in the sample application. The name and password are two different text boxes. So I'll go ahead and type in Don and a very secure password. So as you can see, the name text box is set to single line, and the password text box is set to the password text mode. And whatever I type in is obscured if somebody's looking over my shoulder. So this is the name text box. I'll go over to Properties, and you can see that you can set a number of properties to customize this control. Quite often you'll set a value for the text property, which defines the default text that appears within the page. If you do that, very often programmatically you'll make some sort of change to it, or you allow the user to overwrite that information. Here's the text mode, and this is set to single line, but you can see the other options. Here's the password box, and notice that the text mode is set to password. I'll go over to the source view here, and you can see that essentially all of the properties that you set in the Properties window are defined as attributes within the page. So there's really no magic going on with the text box. Very easy control, a very powerful control for getting user input in the form of text. Another type of input control is a checkbox. ASP.NET has two types of checkbox controls: the checkbox itself and the checkbox list control. We're going to see an example of the checkbox control, which you use to handle Boolean input or true-false values. This control lets users make either-or kinds of selections. It doesn't necessarily need to be yes or no, true or false, but it's some sort of either-or kind of selection. So each checkbox in a form can be set independently of all other checkboxes, unless you write code in order to make them related in some way. And that's a fairly common thing to do. You can either write client-side JavaScript or do something on the server when the page is posted back to the server. Another type of control that is related to the checkbox is a radio button control. Radio buttons let users select one item from a group of mutually exclusive options. Generally, radio button controls appear in logical groupings that you can define on a web form. Let's take a look at how you can use checkbox and radio button controls. The sample input controls page has three different checkboxes: call waiting, caller ID, and call forwarding. Notice that I can set these independently. There's really no relationship between the different checkboxes. I can check as many as I want or as few as I want. I'll come back over to my page definition here, select a checkbox, and look at the properties. One interesting property is the text property. The checkbox itself does not have any text in it, but instead the text property becomes the label that is automatically associated with the control. And then here are the radio buttons. I can click these in turn, but I can only select one of them within the list. Here's another group of radio buttons. Notice that I can select Home, and the United Kingdom remains selected because these radio buttons are in a different group. So radio buttons have a lot of flexibility because you can define your own groups. ASP.NET uses the group name property of each radio button control as a kind of identifier to associate multiple radio buttons with a group. So this is how ASP.NET associates each of the radio button controls with a particular group, so you get that functionality in the browser of being able to select only one item within each group. So at any time, the user can select 0 or 1 item within all of the items that share a common group name property value. The sample page includes two groups, location and service type. So if I click on the United States and go over into the source, you can see that it has the group name property set to location. So all of the radio buttons anywhere on the page that have the group name property set to location are going to be associated within that group. And then the user can only select one of those location radio buttons. It doesn't matter where on the page, they don't have to be adjacent to each other, but they function as a single group. If I go back to Design and select the Home radio button, I can see that that group name is set to service type. So this is a separate group from the location group. And I can set those buttons independently. If you need to create a group of radio button controls, it may be easier to use the radio button list control, which we talk about a little bit later in the course. But be aware that a single radio button list control encompasses only a single group. On the other hand, if you lay out the radio button controls yourself, using the group name property, you can provide multiple groups in the same physical layout, and those groups are dynamic. In other words, you can change the group name at runtime programmatically. So I'm currently running this page, and let's take a look at the source behind it. I'll scroll down a bit to the radio button controls, and you can see once again that the HTML that is generated is quite a bit different from the HTML that is included in the source page. Notice too that the group name is implemented as the name attribute, because this is how the browser groups the individual radio buttons. So once again, you can see how ASP.NET customizes the HTML that is sent to meet the needs and the capabilities of a particular browser.